good evening, all of you, and welcome. It's good to be together. My name is Deb Kaiser-Cross, and I serve as the Minister for Congregational Care here at Naples United Church of Christ, and have been for a while, and it's been wonderful. And I'm joined with my colleagues, Reverend Dr. Sharon Harris-Ewing, who's the Assistant Minister, and the Reverend Dr. Dawson Taylor, who is our Senior Minister, right?
And we're just so excited that Sharon lives.
Right. Yeah, so for all of you, is it okay if we share?
Oh, yes.
For all of you who wondered what was going on with Sharon, poor Sharon had a bike accident and had to have 2 surgeries to fix it. So she's got a big old cast on.
Yep.
And if it's really interesting tonight, it might be her pain medication.
I was going to say, we
Or
actually,
if it's not, it might be my
I was going to say, we actually asked you to up the dose on your pain medicine just to see what would happen to the discussion. So, I mean, truly, this is a Herculean effort for you to be here, so thank you, Sharon.
Thank you very much.
I am glad to be. It's good to get out of the house.
Well, I understand that, too.
Yeah. And so a special thank you to Wendy Geyer, who is our executive assistant, and she sets this stage for us beautifully every single week, and the flowers are always gorgeous. And I want to say thanks to Alex and Jay, who are our production team, who make this happen. And so thank you for being here tonight. And this is about the time where we say, are there any announcements, Dawson?
Yeah. So 2 announcements that I thought about was I want to make sure that people are aware that for the rest of this week through Saturday, we're receiving gifts to our Baby Basics offering. You know, normally we receive that on Mother's Day, but, you know, the complications of COVID, receiving another offering was getting very cumbersome and strange, and so what we finally decided was we would move that to an online offering, as well as people can call into the church office, mail in a check. You know, we'll certainly keep our eyes open and add any checks that come in. So those who want to support this historic mission partner of ours, we welcome that.
You know, some people may not know what Baby Basics does.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that, and it's will be in our e-blast that went out today, and then also again on our Saturday e-blast. But, you know, Baby Basics. I'm a former board member. We're fortunate to be the church home of the founder, Jean Ann Lynch, and her spouse, Dick, and. You know, Baby Basics has this really basic idea, which is, and 2 of you being parents and grandparents, I think understand this better than I do perhaps, but the cost of diapers can be overwhelming, especially to a working family. And so they provide diapers to families, particularly those who are fighting poverty. And so you know, and that can impact the financial welfare of a family in a tremendous way. And so it's really, I think, amazing because this model has become a national model. And so we're really proud of that. And so we are not only a supporter and a mission partner, but we're also a distribution site. So we store diapers here at the church, and then on one Monday evening a month, families come here and receive support. But, you know, they receive so much more than diapers. That's what's amazing, is if you ever want to see the magic of Baby Basics, talk to a board member, talk to a distribution site manager, and ask to go on a distribution night. It's really amazing to see. It's pretty magical, actually.
It is.
And then, of course, we always want to invite people back for worship on Sunday. We'll be here at 9 and 11. You know, I apologize. We had a little bit of miscommunication or communication challenge with the sign-up link. So if you tried to sign up and had challenge using that link, please call the church. We certainly want to make sure that you have a place as long as we have enough space, or you can always join us online and virtually.
Sounds good. Okay, so this is the 5th week of this Clergy Roundtable, based on the book Love is the Way by Bishop Michael Curry. Been a great book. I really have loved it. I've really been encouraged and inspired and challenged in some deep ways as we read it and discussed it, and I don't think this week is any exception.
Right.
So let's get on with it. So chapter 9 is entitled The Real E Pluribus Unum. And the question is, do I have to love even my enemy? I love that one.
Yeah, I got to this, you know, I'm doing the Audible, I got to this, and I was like, oh, I wonder if I can just, like, fast forward through this part. You know?
Yeah. So, but I do think, you know, we've all talked about how difficult it is in these days to deal with people who think very differently from us. And so I was really wondering as I was reading the chapter, was he going to offer anything new in it? And I think he really did. So we'll talk about that going forward. So he said it's really time to move on from the division and conflict, not only in the church, but our nation as well. He said we need to leave behind contempt. Contempt is the belief that the person who disagrees with you isn't just wrong, but worthless. And so the question that got raised for me is, how have you seen this kind of contempt played out? Some of it's really obvious, but maybe it's a little more subtle than that. And what do you think contributes to people harboring contempt for other people?
I was reminded of our conversation last week about Martin Buber and the I thou. And I think one of the things that contributes to contempt is making the other person into an it. And this idea of worthless, I mean, it's almost like you're not even a human being, worthy of my respect or whatever. And I don't think, I want to give myself credit, I don't think I feel contempt for other people. But if I'm really honest, there are people who think so differently, or whose actions are so different that I can't empathize, and I can't sort of understand it. So people, for example, who believe conspiracy theories, or people who believe that the election was stolen, I can't get behind that to just believe something that's so patently untrue. So it's just really hard when you got to find a bridge to find, we've talked a lot about this, but to find the image of God in the other person. And sometimes it's hard.
Yeah, I think about when people take something that is perhaps an issue or a disagreement over a topic, or a disagreement over something that is an issue, and make it personal.
Yeah.
Like for instance, a lot of my role works with a lot of management of the church. And so from time to time, I have disagreements with lay leaders about how we're going to manage the church. But those aren't personal. But what I find, if a conflict arises or if that tension arises, is when one of us makes it personal and loses sight of that. And I think so often what we see in politics, statewide, local, nation, global, is that people make decisions like that personal, not about, so what I remind myself of, and what I think our lay leaders are so good at too, is we are all about and want what's best for the church. Or I think we need to remind each other, we want what's best for the country. We might disagree about that, but that's not personal.
Right.
Or it shouldn't be personal.
Right.
And when it does become personal, that's when we need to re-examine the I, thou, or the contempt that can arise from that.
Great insights, both of you. I was going to say, mine's just a little different. And it really came, I think some people have this need to be one up on other people, to be like, just know a little bit more, or be a little more educated, or a little bit, a sense of superiority. And so when it's, again, that I, it, or what you were just talking about, people have this need to be more than the other person. And I went back in my mind to a conversation I had with a family member who we were having a huge disagreement. I think it was over immigration maybe, and we just had different opinions. And this family member said, well, I've educated myself on this topic. And that for me, just, it became personal. It became personal. And I think that when we go there, and kind of look down on other people, the contempt just feeds.
Don't you often find, too, that that need for superiority is often rooted in insecurity?
Yeah, I do.
I mean, that's just been well, I don't know that it's been my experience, but it's been my assumption.
Yeah.
And again, when I'm in my healthiest, I can see it for that. I can acknowledge that to myself. You're so insecure. No, but like to myself, I can acknowledge what's likely happening,
Yeah.
which for me allows me to be less reactive, less contemptuous about it,
Less personal.
less personal. Again, when I'm at my healthiest.
Right.
The only thing I want to add, because this is just a constant concern for me, there's the nation, as you said, the world, but there's a great deal of polarization within the church. And
Other churches, Sharon.
I'm talking the church. And where I see contempt exhibited is in the churches who want to publish statements that say, if you believe X, Y, Z, you're not Christian. And I used to say to colleagues in a more conservative environment, my tent is big enough to include you.
Yeah.
I need your tent to be big enough to include me. And I think that there are times when, for some Christians, it's, well, if you don't agree with the way I understand faith, then you're not Christian. And that, for me, is an example of contempt.
Yeah.
And this is even a counterpoint. I think it's probably, in knowing me, it's a rabbit trail off to some other idea. But it's also, though, I think churches also get into a mindset that everyone has to agree with everything.
Right.
I think churches get into a mindset often that when there's disagreement or when disagreement arises, that it's dangerous to the life and health of a church. When I think what is dangerous to the life and health of a church is that when everyone thinks alike, or that when disagreement arises and it's not dealt with in healthy ways.
Yeah.
I mean, so I think sometimes, I agree wholeheartedly with what you're saying, Sharon, but also I think churches get in this trap or this mindset that says, but we can't disagree. No, we can't disagree disagreeably.
Right.
And, that's when, to me, when it becomes unhealthy. Because I think, again, one of the things that the church offers society as a gift is to say, we can model disagreement in healthy ways. Right. But again, churches, I think, have gotten so afraid that if anyone disagrees about anything, it's suddenly a sign of something really bad.
Right.
So let's move on into churches, because he starts talking about that. He said one of the most important functions of the church is to be a sanctuary in which people can disagree, even vehemently, and yet still see the other as a brother or sister in Christ, which is exactly what you're talking about. If we cannot do this for ourselves, then we have no ground to preach unity and reconciliation to others. There's no such thing as a perfect institution. He goes on to talk about while the church has many sins in its past and probably present, and needs to engage in the hard work of reconciliation, healing. But he says that while the church is an imperfect institution, it does real good on a huge scale at home and abroad. So, as pastors, how do you balance the imperfections of the church while still acknowledging its gifts to the world?
Drink. No, I mean, because, right, I mean, it is one of the things, it can be so utterly frustrating. I mean, I'm just being really, probably overly vulnerable, but it can be so utterly frustrating to get caught up in the minutia and to watch people get, attached to their email over every dot and tittle of a bylaw change when you want to say, but there are women being trafficked in Immokalee, can we please talk about something that really matters? I mean, so there is that tension that exists in ministry and in pastoral ministry. But one of the things that I love dearly about this congregation as a mission-driven church is that I do think we see the big picture. And, and so one of the things that I like to say often is, let's keep the main thing the main thing. You have to have structures and procedures and all the things in place, especially in a large church like ours. but you have to keep the main thing, that who we are called to be as a church. So that's how I would respond.
And I think over the years, I think I have less patience with the minutia. It may have something to do with the fact that retirement's on the horizon.
I would say over the last 6 months specifically, but
But I have,
No.
and in fact, one of my dear friends who just retired, she's an Episcopal priest, you guys have heard this,
Yeah.
but she said, I'm so glad God got a hold of me before the church did.
Exactly.
And it's not that I literally, I can look at a congregation and love everyone, well, almost all.
Almost, yeah.
No. I can really find something to love. I can see the dignity in everyone. But sometimes when we get together, we're really difficult human beings in a group. So what Michael Curry did for me is to remind me that what the church can do as Big C Church in the world is worth all the petty other stuff that we go through.
Yeah.
And it was just a really good reminder for me.
Yeah. His joy is so infectious.
Yeah, and he just is like, we go through this stuff, we're going to fight, but look what we're doing in the world, and it's better that we have our fights and figure it out so we can still do all this good stuff in the world.
Right.
So,
Well, and just to add a couple of things, we talk about this relatively easily, but I also know that for some people who move into a church community, if they begin to get involved, they get real disillusioned if they discover stuff going on and interpersonal conflicts and stuff, and the church isn't what they thought the church was going to be. So I think it's really important to help people get that the church is imperfect and people are still people and still do things they shouldn't and whatever. But the other thing, this just really brings for mind, and I won't repeat the whole story because I've told it before, but a professor of mine really helped me think about the fact that it is precisely those things that have the great power for good that also have the power for destruction and evil. And I've thought about it frequently in terms of drugs, and that the things that can be really harmful to people also can be really helpful to people. But Rabbi Mikva, who was here in April, virtually, used the image of fire. And the idea that, fire can be very destructive, but it also is really important and positive. And I just think it's precisely because of its power that we can do good, but we also have to acknowledge that we can do some pretty bad things.
yeah. So there's this story he tells. Thank you for sharing that. He tells about his own traumatic brain injury. He had a fall. He had a brain bleed, and it was not discovered for a little while. But so then he had to have a quick surgery, but he was scheduled in 6 weeks to attend a gathering of the Anglican Communion worldwide in Canterbury, Great Britain. He was still suffering from the effects of that surgery, but knew that the gathering to discuss the church's strikingly different attitudes toward human sexuality and marriage equality was too important to miss. So he wasn't his full self. And so he still decided to go. And he realized that the Anglican Church Universal was at a crossroads, and this gathering could mean the difference between a split in the church and a way to move forward towards reconciliation. He believed that he needed to be there to advocate for a way forward that honored every single voice. So that's the story. And so he shares a moment of panic in the book. He's in the airport, and he's just like overwhelmed by all the things. Anybody who's had a traumatic brain injury knows that you can be overwhelmed by, a lot of stimuli. He was still not thinking or speaking 100%. He wasn't able to process things and was easily overwhelmed, and he confessed he wasn't sure he could do the meeting. He prayed that the Spirit would carry him through the days ahead. And I just thought about that, about the times in my life where I knew I couldn't get through something without the power of the Spirit. So I thought I'd ask you guys, was there a time that you've been at that place yourself, so overwhelmed that you knew the only way you could get through it was to rely on prayer and the Spirit? Either one?
Several. I'm trying to
Which one?
boil them down. Yeah. I will say this. I have a prayer that I pray to myself. I've never spoken of this aloud, that I say often on Sunday mornings before I leave my office. The two of you know that I ask of the staff and of our congregation for time to myself in my office just before worship. And as I finish getting my robe on, I pray in my office and I say, okay, God, this is on you. Because I think clergy so often get it confused. I've worked with and am related to enough ministers to know that. And so I've prayed that same prayer in some personal and spiritual crises because I experience that as a prayer of surrender.
Yeah, it is.
Because it's a need to not fight, but it's a need to not worry as well.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, and so
It's that sweet spot between.
yeah, because I see it visually. You know, you all know this particularly. I think in images. I can't push and I can't pull. It's just be. Surrender. And so, you know, as much planning and work and all that we do for worship, at that moment, it's done.
Yeah, it is.
I can't control anything else. And so it's a prayer of surrender. And so especially though, if I'm in a difficult place, personally, spiritually, emotionally, physically, I think to myself, I can't do anything about that in those moments, except react to what's happening. It's a surrender. And so, you know, I think about, especially in my ministry here, 2.5, 3 years ago when the church was in a governance crisis after a staff departure. And there were a lot of people really directing a lot of anger at me, including walking out when I stood up to preach. And to think about the amount to sit in front of people who are literally giving you looks, and you think to yourself, I can't do anything. That is a surrendering moment. But you'd rather be 10,000 miles away, but that's not where you're called to be. You know, but, you know, so there are big moments like that, and then there are moments where you think to yourself, your heart's with your family in Texas because there's a family crisis, but you can't really talk about that. Perhaps close colleagues know about it, but you can't talk about it. So, you know, okay, God, this is on you.
Yeah,
Becomes the prayer.
yeah. Thank you.
And my prayer in those moments is a little different, but it's a similar idea, which is just simply, God, use me.
Yeah.
We've talked at different times about wilderness times and really hard times. And for me, the times that come to mind are transition times when I either have already left or am leaving something and trying to figure out what the next step is. But as I thought about this, I also thought that it's just in my system that even when I think I'm relying on prayer and the Spirit, part of how I think prayer and the Spirit work are through people. And so part of what I found about that story is that he had the wherewithal to ask for help
Yeah.
and to have people helping him not only physically to get through the airport and stuff, but to help him with his words and other things. And I think about that when I'm relying on the Spirit, sometimes the Spirit is working to help me through the people who are giving me feedback or giving me encouragement or whatever. So that came to my mind.
You know, there have been a bazillion times in my life where I feel like I'm at that end and there's nothing left of me, and that's probably where God works best because I get out of the way. But the most recent one was with my mom and doing caregiving for her at the end of life. And I was so, it was in the middle of COVID. I felt emotionally depleted anyway. I felt that because I'm the pastor in the family, I felt like everybody was looking for spiritual nourishment from me. Maybe that was true or not, but my mom certainly was. And I just knew there was just nothing left. And so that was a really desperate prayer. Yeah, it was. And that's the most recent one for me. So, but and I think my prayer is the serenity prayer. God grant me the serenity to
Yeah.
accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, the wisdom to know the difference. And that shows up almost every day.
Yeah.
Just about. So, all right, so we're moving into a little bit more about some specifics on how to have respectful conversations. I have a dear friend who has been trying to do these things, and they're calling them grace-filled conversations in the Methodist Church. She's a Methodist. And about how to engage with people with whom we do not agree. And he talked about the 4 steps that he works with churches on. And the first, pretty simple, but I think they're still really good. First is 1, listen to one another. That means listen more than you talk. 2, pray for each other, especially when you start disagreeing. Love each other. That's a tough one. And finally, discern together to hear what the Spirit might be saying to the church. So my question is, what have you learned over the years about how to have grace-filled conversations on difficult topics in the church? That's hard.
It was interesting because the first word that came to my mind wasn't on that list, and it's there, but not explicit, and that is respect.
Yeah.
And that we have to start, and it's like one of those ground rules is with respect for each other. And that's an assumption that the image of God is in you every bit as much as the image of God is in me, but it's also respecting that you're doing the best you can at that moment, that you're trying to figure out your own truth. So you enter the conversation not with a can I get you, but we're going to try to learn from each other because I respect you, and that's the foundation. The other thing that I thought about is it's a little different than this, but I think sometimes we get caught up on language, that somebody has to say something in the same way I would say for us to be compatible or to be sharing a belief or something. And I've just really learned from being in different communities that we can use different faith to express, or different words to express our faith. And yet it can be just as real, and it's really important to me not to insist that somebody else has to, describe their Christology in the same way that I do, but they can have the same faith in Jesus Christ.
This is not as, I don't intend for this to be as narcissistic as it can sound, but I have to do a lot of work on myself to have really healthy conversations. And that typically means that I make the best assumptions about people going into. Because if I go in with the assumption and with the relationship of saying, what have I accomplished alongside this person in the past? What good have we done together? What joys have we shared? It just always goes a lot better than when I start with, well, I'll show them, or they're out to get me, those kinds of things. And then, actually my dad and I were talking about this on a call, I think 2 nights ago, about a situation that we were talking about that frankly doesn't even include me. But I was talking about a leadership lesson I learned a long time ago, that someone taught me that, if you find yourself reacting to something, you really ought to ask yourself what's causing that reaction. And so again, to me, that's a lot of the self-work. So that if I'm in a conversation with someone and we're trying to work something out, and I find myself tensing up, or I try in the moment, I'm not always able to do it, but certainly afterward, to say, what was that about? what fear was there, or what insecurity was there. And again, with the people I have the best relationships with, I'm able, if not in the moment, I at least am able to often go back and say, wow, that was really not the reaction I wanted to have, or I've figured out that really hit a button for me that I wanted to explain to you and I want to apologize about, or, so again, that's self-work. And the last thing I would say is I have to be honest in conversations, and I need people to be honest with me. So if my feelings are hurt or if I'm offended, I don't have to verbally beat the person up about it, but I have to own that. And just say, that did offend me. And if they apologize, the ability to say, I accept your apology, I think is actually really powerful. And that's actually something I only learned in the last couple of years in therapeutic
Forgive
work.
to live.
Yeah, well, and then I had a therapist that and pastoral counselor who I remember one time saying something had happened, and I said, I'm sorry about that. And he said, I accept your apology. And I just had this moment where I said, that's really powerful. When people do that. And so it was a learned thing that now if someone offers me an apology, I verbally say, I accept your apology. And if I offer it, I will say, can you accept that apology? Because I think there is affirmation in that and honesty, the need for honesty in that.
I don't have much to add to that except for when I'm having a conversation with a difficult conversation, I really need to come with curiosity and humility, that I really want to learn from the other person what their worldview is. And so that's really helpful. And, you already mentioned it, kind of coming with generous assumptions about the other person, that we both intend good for each other, which isn't always easy.
Especially with you getting ready to retire. Because I will literally walk into Deb's office and say, what's that thing you always tell me I'm supposed to go with? Yeah, generous assumptions. Yeah.
Well, and for me, that's part of what I was talking about with respect, is that sense
Just
of
generous assumptions,
Yeah.
So I'm going to skip a couple of the questions on here because we're kind of zipping through. So I'm going to, this whole conversation that happened with the Anglican Communion.
Oh, yeah.
He took the time after the whole experience happened to communicate the action of the Anglican leadership on marriage equality with the Episcopal Church in the United States. So, mind you, his mind was still fuzzy. He's trying to figure out how to say it. And he got some help from some people, but he really needed to communicate it. So he said, while there could have been a schism in the church, they were able to move forward with differences, yet still as one communion. He said to this, we had not changed the vow of marriage, but we had expanded who could be married, in line with our belief that gay and lesbian followers of Jesus deserved equality in the church. Doing so is not unlike an act of civil disobedience in which one violates an unjust law, both to change the law and, more importantly, to prick the conscience, awakening the heart to the universal human cry. That prick may not yield immediate resolution, but it creates the room and space for relationships that in time find a way forward, honoring the dignity of all. Love that. So I found those words to be really helpful in defining the function of civil disobedience and its potential impact on moving the arc of justice forward. What were your thoughts when you read that?
Oh, I think it's your turn.
I just remember thinking to be that gifted, humble, articulate, as a leader, as a pastor, as we say in my Methodist heritage, moving on to perfection someday. Because I just, and Bishop Curry is known to have handled that potential schism with such care. And I think that will be one of his great legacies as the presiding bishop. Obviously, his work on racial justice and reconciliation and many other things. But I will say it brought tears to my eyes, both of his affirmation of the LGBTQ plus community, but just his great pastoral care. It did bring the image of the Great Shepherd, of how he handled his communion, his community within the greater Anglican communion. I don't know
And
that
when you
that's
think about
any
what-
great insight. I just
Well,
was
when
inspired.
you think about what other denominations have gone through
and are going through.
and still going through, and the brokenness. I mean, the whole approach is such a model. It is remarkable.
And I think an unsung hero, well, he alludes to it later in the chapter, an unsung hero of that story is the Archbishop of Canterbury,
Yes.
who does not favor marriage equality, but, at least as I understand it, created a process by which there could be unity within difference of understanding. And so, and I think that's to be commended, because what makes me think about that is it feels like so many denominations, especially in the United States, have set it up as you either win or you lose.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And I feel like what the Archbishop did was create a space in which there could be disagreement and still maintain unity.
And I think, when you read about the process of what they went through day by day, there were some spiritual practices in
Yeah.
there that were profoundly moving. And we don't have a lot of time to talk about
Yeah.
it, but they washed each other's
That's
feet.
the thing that got me, was I thought, wow.
Wow. I mean, it's not a part of our tradition so much, but
Right.
it's profoundly moving. And, I mean, I know we need to move on, so.
Yeah.
Okay. So then Curry writes, love makes it possible to disagree on bedrock convictions and yet stay in relationship. There's a valid concern that doing so forces you to compromise on principles, but sometimes you have to run the risk because of greater danger, chaos, and self-destruction. He then moves from the church to the nation and says, if we can't make room for people with differing viewpoints, we aren't living in a democracy anymore. We're in a dictatorship. So without posing a particular question here, did you have any comments about what he wrote?
I have a long way to go.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
our nation does too.
Yeah.
Well, and I really was thinking about the nation and the concern, which I think comes up later, but we just have such polarized views that there's the unwillingness to listen, to respect each other, and that sense of we're going to win or lose.
Right.
And when I think about even in terms of governmental processes, that one side's going to win and one side's going to lose, rather than we're going to work together to find a solution that supports the common good. And it's a deep concern, and I don't have the answer. The
feel like
church can read this and say, this is what God calls us to do. I don't think Congress is going to read this and say, oh.
I feel like another way of saying that win or lose is it's you're either in or you're out.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's where we focus so much attention.
And he spent a lot of time talking about compromise is really not a dirty word.
Yeah.
But in our culture, compromise seems to be frowned upon. It's, if you're compromising, you are giving up bedrock convictions and you're just going to go down the wrong road. And he's really pointing out that relationship is more important than being right.
Right.
And I think that's just a lost thought in our culture.
Oh.
I mean, I think in the church we get it a little bit more, or at least we try.
Mm-hmm.
We do recognize relationship is more important than being right
We
sometimes.
at least value it. I
We
don't think
do.
we always practice it.
We don't always practice
but
it, but I
value it.
But I actually think we try really hard
No, I
to
I
do
don't
it.
disagree. Yeah, but
and-
there's no value for it in Washington. I
No.
mean, I can speak to that firsthand. I mean, there's
No,
just
there
not.
isn't.
Yeah.
So, all right, I'm going to move on to chapter 10 because we're running out of time. So, I'm trying to figure out where I'm going to go because we have so much more to do. All right. He begins the chapter with honestly addressing what he sees as the divisions in our nation. He points out racial divisions, socioeconomic divisions, and political divisions. He points out that powerful forces exploit the pain that has led to extremism. And we're obviously stuck in those divisions. Curry reminds us that many are ready to move forward with one voice that says, no more. We choose love. We choose community. But we have a lot of work to get to. So while his words ring with truth for me, I know how difficult it is to speak with and listen to each other as we share our truths. Can you share an example where you actually saw that happen somewhere recently?
The thing that came to my mind is, and it's not exactly in terms of these kinds of differences, but as a team, the vulnerability that we value and the willingness to tell our truths to each other. And I can say that's far beyond anything I've experienced in any other workplace. And so that's been a gift for me. And it's not telling my truth to somebody who disagrees with me, fundamentally on every issue, but it's still an opportunity. And I think, Deb, as I think about classes that you've taught and I've taught and we've taught together, we've tried to create that kind of community where people do value the relationship and feel like it's okay to disagree. It doesn't happen as much as perhaps it could, but we've both certainly been in situations where it has happened and it's really important. And when somebody says to me, wow, this is the first time I've been able to say this aloud in a church, it's really, it means a lot to me, then I think we're doing something right in creating that space for people. It doesn't get us to the people who are, completely different, but it's a starting place.
Yeah. As he said, if we can't do it in the church, we're certainly not going to be able to do it in the world.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, Sharon, is our conversation, was it last week or 2 weeks ago, where we were talking about creating safe places, safe spaces for people, and whatever that looks like. Safety for looks different for almost everyone. But the reality, and actually I think it really, the intentionality behind that actually started when David and Deb arrived on our team, because I remember you and I having a lot of conversation about what does it look like for people to be able to really name and claim some of those challenges in a church like ours, where, in a community like ours, it's not always popular to name and to talk about some of the challenges you're having or that your children are having or even grandchildren, but that we want to be that church or that place where people can be honest.
And sometimes
support.
it's about ways that the church has hurt them in the
Sure.
past.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go ahead and move forward to, Curry wrote about Moses and the burning bush, where Moses hears the voice of God saying, take off your shoes, for you're standing on sacred ground. The reason that Moses had to take off his shoes was not that the dirt itself was holy, but that the space was made holy because God was about to tell God's story. Whenever someone tells their story, you are standing on holy ground. You behave differently, you hear them differently, and react from a different place. It's so much harder to hate when someone has shown you their heart. Stories have a way of opening us up to a conversion of the heart, according to Curry. Have you had an experience that changed you because somebody shared a story that helped you see them differently that you want to share?
Go ahead.
Well, I've experienced it, the reciprocal of that, and that is having people share with me about the evolution of their understanding of LGBTQ rights and understandings because they've experienced the stories and the experiences of the LGBTQ community. I mean, that was a huge thing of Harvey Milk back in the late 70s, was come out and tell your story, because it's easy to hate an issue, but not a person.
That's exactly.
And I just think about that from, women who have had abortions to those who are less fortunate to those who struggle with mental illness. I mean, when we tell our stories and tell our truths, it becomes a human story and not an issue.
Amen. I remember when I first came here, I was sitting in a hospital cafeteria and talking to a couple, and one of them made an allusion to a child having some difficulties, and the other one didn't know what was going on and kind of danced and tiptoed around the issue. And then finally somebody said, yeah, he's been having problems with alcohol. And the other person said, I didn't know that. Mine is too. And then I said, my husband's in recovery. And it suddenly like opened the floodgates for everybody because we could tell each other the story. And it was such a profound moment. And, we just being open and telling a story makes a difference.
Yep. And I thought not so much of examples where, I had negative feelings towards somebody and then I had positive, but I've always felt like one of the gifts of being a pastor is people's willingness to share their stories. And I always try to communicate when they do what a gift that is. And what it does is to give me so much deeper an appreciation. And I think about a friend, this is many years ago, who shared with me that she'd lost a sibling when she was a teenager. And just knowing that part of her story, I just understood a lot about her in a different way. And the fact that her own daughter was named after the person who had died. And when I've had a friend who I worked with who talked a lot about his son who was struggling with intense and extreme depression. And this colleague of mine was checking on his son daily because there was such a threat of his not even living. And it just, it's just that gift of knowing somebody and understanding them at a much deeper level.
Yeah, it is. So there's a part of this chapter that is focused on how to get to that place where we can speak together despite our differences. And his first advice was to examine which stories are taking our time and attention, which was quite challenging when I think about what I listen to and pay attention to. Then he quoted a book that centered around a statistical study of American society at the level of zip code that shows a really sad fact. America's essentially segregated itself not primarily along racial lines, but into communities of like-mindedness. You have Democratic-leaning zip codes, Republican-leaning zip codes, and independent-leaning zip codes. Apart from this, of course, we have media segregation. We watch programs where we never, ever have to hear an opinion different than our own. I'd love to hear your comments on that. It was a bit of a surprise when I read the zip code thing, but not really. What did you think when you read that?
Mine was the surprise around the news thing. I mean, it was like the obvious statement that I've never thought about.
Right.
So I will admit, like when I bought my home almost 5 years ago, like, I didn't run any, I mean, come on, we live in Clergy County. There wasn't much hope I was going to find like a certain, political leaning, community. But it was about, when I thought about, you can literally, when he states that you can literally watch news for, I think he has a time frame on it or something, for this many hours or whatever, and never hear a piece of news or opinion that you disagree with, I went, whoa. I mean, that is, I find that so, it should be a disruptive statement to all of us about how we receive information.
Well, and it is in the sense that it really just puts in your face the fact that journalism is inherently biased, and that even though it's being purported as facts by one perspective or another, it's much more than a fact. And even the choice of what to talk about is an example of bias, that there are some stations that will talk about things that the other station never talks about. And what troubles me, lots of things trouble me, but what I thought about in terms of this is something that it just very specifically bothers me about Florida. And that is that in terms of the state, we're about 50-50 Democrats and Republicans. But because of gerrymandering and other things, when you look at the Florida legislature, it's completely lopsided. And so what could be an opportunity for really good dialogue about different perspectives and different ways of solving real problems becomes a which side wins and which side loses. And that's just an example of the problem when you're so polarized. And somewhere in this, he talks about we lose the sensible center.
Oh, I loved that.
Yes.
That the sensible center becomes silent. And that is just so true. Yeah,
I love that line.
Yeah, I thought that was a great phrase.
Yeah. He quotes Madeleine Albright,
Yeah.
which I love this line. She said, "Instead of conspiring with the like-minded, we need to spend more time learning from those we consider wrong-headed." I loved it.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna, I think why don't you make a comment on that first? Has there been a recent time when you've had a conversation with someone you might have considered wrong-headed? And did you learn from that conversation anything new?
Not today. Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of opportunity, and it's not just political. But I mean, there's lots of opportunities for those kinds of quote wrong-headed conversations. I think again the challenge is inward.
Absolutely.
You know the old saying, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Am I willing to listen, or am I going to try to convince their wrong-headedness up against potentially my wrong-headedness? I don't know.
And I think what makes it harder is what you said about the main thing being the main thing and putting it in a different way. The issue's not the issue.
Yeah.
Sometimes when you're talking about things, what's the real issue between you is not what you're talking about. And so you really got to go several layers deep to get the heart of the difference.
Very
And
true.
I think it's back to what he said, is asking yourself, why am I reacting this way?
Yeah.
Because I do think the hardest work is internal, because we're not going to be able to respond differently to other people unless we're aware of what we're doing in the situation, because it always takes two to get through it. So what I'm going to do now is my very favorite part of the entire 2 chapters is the last thing I'm going to talk about. So he concludes this chapter by describing an across-the-aisle dialogue encouraged by a man named Charles Robinson, who is both the rector of St. Luke's in Park City, Utah, and a therapist. He has been instrumental in bringing people with differing perspectives together in a structured environment to encourage deep listening and respectful dialogue. And he likes to ask participants this question, and I'm going to take this one forever. He said, for a particular issue, let's imagine it's immigration, LGBTQ issues, gun violence, you name it, one particular issue. For this issue, what is the story of your life that brought you to that conclusion? It opens people up to hearing somebody else's story. Have you ever done that? I mean, I have never thought of that particular question.
And I haven't asked that particular question. I think more general questions about, how did you get there or something. But when I read your question and you're lifting that up, my immediate thought was that in many ways, that is exactly what we've done in the Clergy Roundtable. That so much, and part of the richness is that we come from very different experiences, And so much of what we've learned about each other is how you got to be you and the kinds of experiences that shaped your theology and your political beliefs or whatever. So we didn't ask each other that question, but in a sense, as we've asked other questions, that has emerged.
Yeah. I think about, I've asked questions similar to that, certainly not that eloquent, in teaching. When I'm teaching a class, perhaps maybe a broad question when preaching or something. But I wonder, what I was thinking about when I saw your question and how you framed it is, I wonder how some of my more difficult conversations would be different if I asked that question one-on-one.
That's what I was thinking. I
Yeah.
was thinking about like some of the differences we may have with another church member, because the issue is probably not the issue.
Right.
And to say, tell me the story of how you got to that place. Was there a particular incident that happened? Was there a particular person who helped you understand it this way? Could you tell me that story? I'd love to know.
Yeah.
And I just realized, I'm thinking of, for example, we've had some real differences of opinion about, steps to combat gun violence in this church, because there are people, who are gun rights advocates and people who really want to, limit, options for gun ownership. And I would really love to hear stories, because often I'll hear, well, my dad taught me how to hunt, and I have those good memories of that. And so then, I'll say, what I would say to that person, because I've had this conversation, is that I've never touched a gun in my life. I grew up in the San Francisco area. Nobody has guns. I mean, it's not a normal part of life. And so I said, tell me why that, what memories that evokes. And it just and then eventually we got to the place where we were able to say, well, there are some common sense things we can all agree on. But it took the stories.
Right. And again, I think it's kind of like what we were saying earlier. I believe it's harder to attack, hate, dislike someone's story
Right.
than it is someone's issue.
Right.
I think it's so much more powerful
Yeah.
and impactful.
And that really is my takeaway from these two chapters. For me, it's looking at the person and trying very hard to engage in a conversation that takes us a little bit lower and deeper so that we can actually hear each other.
Yeah.
So maybe my last question for the night is, what's your takeaway from these two chapters?
Well, as a follow-up, I'm
Sure.
thinking about the people that I have the hardest time with that I said at the beginning. Might be, as an example, people who really believe conspiracy theories, and some of them bizarre. And you all know that a few months ago, I did a women engaged discussion on conspiracy theories. And one of the articles that we read talked about what not to do in responding to somebody. And one of them was, you don't attack, you don't say you're crazy, you don't belittle the person, but it was to try to empathize, and again, not as eloquently, but was kind of trying to figure out what's behind this and what led them to that. So it is a lesson for all of us in
It really
terms
is.
of
Yeah.
understanding someone else.
Again, I think not necessarily to take away from these two chapters specifically, but just I continue to be struck as we have the richness of these conversations is the joy of who he is as a person, as a pastor, as a bishop, as the presiding bishop in the United States. And, as we were talking earlier, when you're a pastor or when you're a human being and you have those times where you reach the end of your rope. And as we've all been transparent to say, pastoring during a pandemic has been very challenging and exhausting. And I think one of the great gifts that he has given me personally in this book is just reminding me of the sheer joy it is to be a pastor.
Yeah, I felt that from him too.
Yeah.
I really have.
And-
And
and
he's
so
been
for-
at it a long time.
Yeah.
And he still feels that.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's like your age. No, I'm kidding. No, I'm kidding. No,
I think he's
just-
my age.
Whoa, no. I just, like you can just sense, especially again, I have the gift of hearing him on Audible, which I just love when the authors read their books.
Yeah.
But, like you just know. You remember, I think it was like the first week, maybe the second week, we were talking about the difference between joy and happiness. Like, he is a joyful person.
Yeah.
And
Hopeful.
And hope-filled and hopeful. Yeah.
Which is my great segue because we're out of time, but I have a great blessing for you.
Wonderful.
So next week we're going to do the last 2 chapters
I was going to say next week's
And
the
the
last
appendix.
and the appendix, and Sharon's going to do that for us.
And it's the last week, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
I know. So I want to share with you a little blessing on hope from Jan Richardson. And she writes, hope nonetheless, hope despite, hope regardless, hope still, hope where we had ceased to hope, hope amid what threatens hope, hope with those who feed our hope, hope beyond what we had hoped, hope that draws us past our limits, hope that defies expectations, hope that questions what we have known, hope that makes a way where there is none. Have a great evening. Thanks for joining us.